We are today with Dr. Rebecca Nicholson. She's an author and a podcast host. She's worked extensively in the peacebuilding field. We will first discuss about the donors, what's their role, how do they function actually also internally, and what's the impact of their decisions on the communities. And then we switch to the main topic, which is peace or violence, a thin line. It definitely is a thin line. And we're going to touch topics like the Lederach gaps, the uprising in Iran now in October 2022. Many things. Quite interesting person, quite interesting discussion. Check it out. Good. Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
Hi, Pascal. I'm excellent. How are you?
Thanks. I'm very fine. Thank you very much. Good to have you here. We're today with Dr. Rebecca Nicholson. Very happy to have you here on this podcast. You're an expert in conflict. You do work at the different levels, complexity levels. You have also authored a couple of books, 3 books, if I'm right. And you also host a podcast called The Conflict Doctor. Very good name. It would be interesting to talk a little bit about this as well. You have a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution. And I'm very happy to have you here on the CoPC podcast. So we promote interesting people, interesting projects, publications, and so on. And I think you're the right person on the right podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a big pleasure. So the title of this podcast is Violence or Peace, a Thin Line. And we're going to elaborate this thin line. But maybe first, we always want to know a little bit more about the person with whom we discuss. So who is Rebecca Nicholson?
Such a nice broad question. Okay. Well, for the purposes of this podcast, as you mentioned, I'm a doctor of conflict analysis and resolution. And because listeners might not be familiar with what that is, I'll say the working definition of conflict that I use is the real or perceived blocking of goals between 2 or more interdependent parties.
Yeah.
The books that I've written, and really the focus of my work, is always the intersection between personal and societal conflict, because conflict occurs at every single level. We can have all the way from internal conflict, interpersonal, family, systemic, law, international, all the way up to armed conflict, war. And so my discipline allows me to navigate all of these different layers and understand the interconnectedness of it. The books that I've written, 3 of them, the first one, it was my dissertation research. And what I was looking at was how donors, international donors who contribute $1 million or more to international development projects, how they understand conflict in their grant-making process.
We will elaborate on this. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Because when we're looking at international development, post-war development, poverty alleviation, all of the different issues that are prevalent around the world, then we look at intervention efforts. And what I was looking at is why we know how to build roads. We know how to build hospitals. We know how to build infrastructure. Why are we 70, 100 years later? Like, why isn't it working? Why aren't these efforts sustainable? So that's what I was looking at. Now, the way that it's examined in literature is donors are looked at in, first of all, a macro sense. So you're just looking at macroeconomics. You're looking at it at a very high level. And donors are clumped in, individual donors, government donors, they're all clumped in as a fixed entity. And then within the equation, it's as if everybody has equal power. So the fundamentals that I was looking at are, first of all, donors have a disproportionate amount of power. So to place them in a proportion to everybody else is automatically flawed. So if you're looking at government donors, that's one thing. There are political motivations for why any government donates money. And then if you're looking at private donors, it's the same thing. There are specific reasons. They call it in philanthropy donor intent. So there are specific reasons. So what I was looking at is you have this group of people. I looked at private donors.
There's always an agenda. No? That's what you're saying.
There's always an agenda, always an agenda. And this is not necessarily a malevolent agenda, but there's always an agenda. People don't do things for no reason. So just to wrap it up, what I was looking at was there's a reflection of the macro. So if you're looking at World Bank or United Nations, those are systems, but systems are made up of people. So if we're going to understand systems, we need to understand the micro individuals, how people think. And especially with private donors who you cannot negotiate with, you need to understand how people think. And that's what I was looking at.
Why you say you cannot negotiate with? Because the agenda is given, or usually there's at least some space for exchange and, maybe adapting or what are you saying? Why is there no negotiation or no influence? That's what you're saying, I guess.
The short answer is because they don't have to.
Right.
They're in the powerful position.
Because
they don't have to.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. And that's it. So and you imagine that when you look at microloans, for example, and you look at what a small amount of money does for a family, for a community, then for a generation, these are $100, $200 loans that will buy an animal. So you imagine what $1 million would do if it was directed in a way that was based on sustainability. So my interest was, if one is able to look at the funding process and look at their own funding process, even one, the results can be generational. But that all comes from how an individual with the ability to make those decisions goes about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would like to come back about the idea that there is always an agenda. So I wonder what type of agenda this could be. Could you imagine about? Could you think about examples where the positive agendas, really in the receiver's needs and in the receiver's interest, and not, because the idea that gives is that, okay, it's in the agenda of the donor and it might be purely unilateral, but might there be an agenda or an intent which is positive for the receiver, which is, I guess in most cases it is positive, otherwise you wouldn't be accepted. But that maybe, I'm thinking about an example that I know where actually the evaluation is very technical, and it is funding that is channeled, and then it's another entity that actually distributes the money, and they do I would say purely technical evaluation of the submitted projects. And I know others, and it's true that for many donors, it's either, it depends a little bit on the level where there is an intent. It can be specific countries, specific regions, specific types of projects, specific beneficiary groups. But I would like to see if there is what's the positive part of the donor intent and of the agenda setting.
Thinking of how to explain it. Agenda setting is not a term that's particularly useful in this context. It is that people have different objectives with their time, with the direction of their life, with the direction of their resources. So they will approach something in the way that they feel is the best way. So if you're talking, for example, somebody from a Western context who has, again, I'm looking at poverty alleviation. That's specifically where my area was in post-war development. So if you are talking about a white donor who has woken up that morning in a comfortable bed, in a comfortable house, and then goes out and has nice warm coffee and a breakfast, then gets in a car that they own and drives on roads and goes to an office building with, you understand, that's a particular life. So you have that person who typically has no idea who their beneficiary is at the other end, who did not have a comfortable night's sleep, who, if it's a post-war situation, wakes up several times a night with trauma, who wakes up probably possibly on a dirt floor but not comfortable conditions. The roads aren't there because they've been destroyed. The car, there is no such thing. Nobody owns a car. So you understand, like, these are very different realities. And so you have one person living in a particular reality, imagining that they have something to say about the reality of another person without having any idea what that is like. So I wouldn't go so far. There are definitely people who have agendas, but more often what is going on is the blind spot of not having any idea what the lived realities and what the needs are of people who you have no idea what their life is about.
So it's a kind of distortion and, lack of knowledge on whatever we call it. And maybe a good approach would be, I don't know if this exists somewhere, but maybe that, but probably, I think technically not possible, but that beneficiaries would actually be part of the governing boards of such funds, for instance. But since there are so many, it's probably difficult to select and to pick the right ones. But probably the idea would be good if it's doable. I don't know if that's an idea, if it exists somewhere.
All things are doable, and all ideas exist somewhere, and that's one of the really difficult elements of being in this kind of work is you see the possibilities. There are so many solutions available, but when it actually comes time to work these solutions, that's not how it looks. That's just not how it looks. That's not what the industry looks like. Nobody's trying to be the first person to do that. So you may have one or two donors, but I'll say in my experience, in my research, in my time in professional philanthropy, and since then in talking with people who are working in these areas, working in war zones, working in post-war, working in development, this just isn't the way it goes. So that's why I say that's what I was looking at in my research. These are systems. And in order to change the systems, individuals need to see a need to do it differently. And when you have a group of people who has all of the resources and essentially all of the power, and they don't see a need to do it differently, that's kind of what it looks like. So that's what we're up against.
Yeah, so this situation also gives somehow the idea of some kind of relation of domination, that there is some donor and gives money for what the donor wants to give it, and the beneficiary has to follow. And how do you see that? What is the relation of domination? Does this fit into this setting?
I think maybe some examples would be useful, because the domination in a literature type of sense is a word that would be accurate. But for anybody listening, let's put that into a real life context, because it sounds, it sounds like somebody with a dark mask and some weapons, but that's not how it actually looks. Okay.
More the relational aspects of it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So let me see. In South Sudan, English is spoken. Many places in Africa, English is spoken. A lot of that has occurred because of English-speaking missionaries. And so here's the issue. It's useful to speak another language. It seems like it would give more possibilities for education, for economics. It seems like it would provide a path for upward trajectory. And here's where the domination part comes in. And this has been historical, and this was also reflected in my research fewer than 10 years ago, the same attitude. Yeah. It's not like the educational purpose, like the educational benefit of it is a byproduct. The point in teaching English was so that those villages, those communities, so that they could read the Bible. The purpose was religious conversion. If somebody happened to get something from being able to speak another language, that's like a happy byproduct. But that was absolutely not the objective, and it remains not the objective. So I mean, this is where we come in and say how you use the word agenda. That's a really specific agenda, looking for religious conversion. So even to the point where, it becomes absurd talking with donors who are saying things like, They're looking at people who are starving, literally starving, going blind with starvation, dehydrated, don't have basic needs, not because of anything they've done wrong, but just like that's what the circumstances are where they live. Then I'm speaking with donors who are saying what they're really hungry for is the word of God. So we don't spend our money, the donor's saying this, we don't spend our money on food because what they really need, they don't really need rice, even though they're starving.
Okay.
What they're really hungry for is the light of God, the word of God. So that's a really prime example, and that's way more prevalent than you think.
Is that an example that you experienced, that you saw personally?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That was one of my research participants.
Right. Okay. Yeah, the whole language issue is important. I worked quite often in the French-speaking part in some development countries where, the existence of the French language comes back mainly to the previous colonial situation, and it also creates actually a kind of domination, but within society. You have the French speakers and the non-French speakers. And the French speakers are the one usually coming from, better situated families, having access to higher education, private schools, and so on and so on. And the others don't, So the whole issue of identity also important in this aspect. Good. I don't know if you want to add something more about the role of donors, the situation of donors that is.
Yeah, well, actually, maybe it's useful also. I'll tell you the 4 areas that I was looking at.
Yeah, please.
I was looking at content, process, relational, and identity. So when I was doing long form interviews with donors, I was looking at first content. How do they actually understand the issue they are involved with? Yeah. So if it's a policy issue, do they understand how the public policy making works, how the government works, how those decisions are made? Do they actually understand that? Do they actually, how do they actually understand what the conditions are of the people who their money is supposed to be serving? So like the actual content, the actual substantial part of it. The next part was the process. So how is the communication taking place? What does the actual grant application look like? If the NGO they're working with is having an issue, do they communicate? Do they pick up the phone? Do they email? And what I found is there's basically no communication. So that's what
my experience as well. It's usually not always, but in many situations, many cases, difficult to get in touch because they don't need it. That's what you said before. They pick out the best applications, and if you have questions, very often difficult to get through. And also, I guess, again, the language issue, in which language the call is issued, and,
they were all English.
Access. And,
they were all English, so it didn't matter. So
then you close the doors for a huge number of people potentially applying.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Then the other 2 issues were relational. So I was specifically looking at and asking about the power dynamics.
Yeah.
And the donors I talked to, everybody was acutely aware of the power dynamics. And some of them really thrived on it, while others attempted to mitigate it. But everybody is aware of the power dynamics and the power imbalance and the power asymmetry that goes on. And then the final element that I looked at was the role of identity, the identity of the donors. And that was a really telling part. Whatever they had talked about in these interviews, they lasted 3 or 4 hours each. And what I found was the common thread, how they approached it, how they approached their grant making, how they approached their involvement, that all was reflected in the piece about their identity. So how an individual sees it is really the way that they go about it. How
projecting the own identity, the own experiences on foreign contexts is that what you're saying?
Some of it is protecting, like that's this is the best way, so other people need to do it this way also.
No, not protecting, projecting.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. Projecting. Actually, kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. Definitely. Definitely that. Yeah. And then there were others who were actually came up with 4 typologies. So that was one expression. Then there were others who were very concerned with the process. And so they were really concerned with what the end result looked like for the beneficiaries. So they were really paying attention to the process. And every time they were involved in something, like they were involved heavily at every single point, lots of communication, lots of knowledge about what they were involved in. So those donors do exist as well. We don't really see the results of them all that much, but those donors definitely exist as well. Yeah, but this is what I found, that again, in my findings, and I was looking at the micro and how that affects the macro, the content, there was not among most donors. And again, this is like not just my research, but then continuing to follow up on this research in my experience in my professional life, the content is typically not well understood. The information, how it's received, is by Google or because their friends also donated to that. So they kind of pass NGOs around, and so the relationship aspect, there is as far as the communication, there's a lot more dependency on, I'll say, a relationship, like, do I trust this person, rather than open communication. So from a conflict resolution standpoint, there are very obvious changes and adjustments that could be made where the end result would look a lot different than it does now, in a way that would be really quite a bit more useful for all parties involved.
Principles that are known, I would say sometimes they are followed, but definitely not always. And there's the kind of one-sided identity, reduction in terms of vision and so on. But the principles of local ownership, for instance, are there, but certainly not always applied fully, or not enough. Yeah. Are you involved somehow? I saw on your website that there is a chapter on philanthropy. I don't know if you're involved, if you're consulting, or if you're yourself on a board, or what is your engagement with the donor field?
Currently with the donor field, I do consulting for nonprofits, and I do consulting for them to, one of them, for example, was a nonprofit, and they were stepping into the space of human trafficking. Yeah. So what they did was very, very valuable, but they weren't getting any reception with donors. So what I did is I listened to their message, I listened to what they're doing, and I said, okay, so here in everything you're doing, here is the one piece that you're not communicating because it's so natural to you. You don't know other people don't know this, but it's this one piece. So if you adjust it by 30 seconds, then all of a sudden it casts your work in an entirely different light. So that's what I do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Framing the things, using the same keywords, the right keywords, and so on. That's crucial indeed.
Yes. And I hold out hope. Oh God, I hold out hope all the time that some foundation, some organization would be interested in these findings. I'm always on the lookout, but I haven't found them yet. So if somebody's interested, that's why I want to do this work. I haven't found any takers yet.
That's a good call. I hope some are among the audience and might maybe come back to you. That would be certainly a good thing. Right. I would like to come back a little bit to your different types of work, since we have explored this part with the role of donors. And in terms of conflict work, you work with teams, you work with corporations, you work on peace building, and also with families, couples, so more micro level. Isn't that a huge split, or does it come natural, or what are the commonalities in maybe your approach, or in the situation, in the dynamics? How do you manage these different levels in terms of to have a coherent approach?
For me, the coherency is in the variation of levels, because each of us, there's a saying, as above, so below. And in literature, this is looked at the micro versus the macro, We each are microcosms of our society, of our world. In conflict situations, if we're talking about politics, if we are talking about an organization, if we're talking about global leaders or global organizations, whatever you're looking at, those are not entities, like a system can't make a choice. People in that system make a choice. If you're in a relationship that's dysfunctional, the relationship is not dysfunctional. Like you, the people, are dysfunctional. You are participating in behavior that is dysfunctional. It's the same with organizations. People's individual choices are what make these systems. I look at politically, for example. I'm in the United States right now, and there is such political tension. I've been involved in politics since I was a teenager. It has never been like this. And it's been very deliberately cultivated to bring people to a boiling point right now. These are conditions that are brought about. However, we as individuals always have the choice to recognize our behavior and our participation in it and step back and to take a different course. So to answer your question more directly about the different levels, I look at big problems, but big problems aren't solved on a high level. Big problems are solved because people will choose to do things differently. So I look at systems and the issues of systems and then break it down so that they are observable behaviors that people can see in themselves, in their groups, and in others. So if they want to change it, then they actually have the tools to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I fully agree that, we have to take action, we have to decide and to, to take actions for whatever is, conflict resolution or whatever is not going well. On the other hand, there's maybe a more, I don't know if that's the right term, structuralist approach. Or also, if we refer to Rousseau, who says, I don't know how in English what the right translation is, but the human is good, but corrupted by society. So by the structures. That's how I read it, at least. So in how far would you say, okay, for sure the human has to act and to take responsibility and so on, but in how far are we also prisoner of the structures that we created?
That's a great question. we could spend about the next 6 months just breaking that down. Right. Let me see. I'm trying to think of some specific examples. Okay. Let's look at, my first industry was politics. So let's look at politics.
Yeah.
The reason that I got involved in politics as a teenager is because I was very optimistic. And even then I was aware of problems. I was of the mind, however, that if you put good people in office.
What motivated you to get involved?
I have no idea. I was a really weird child. This is just what I did instead of having friends or doing other things that teenagers do.
So what was your first action? Like demonstrating in the streets or going to a congress, or what was?
Oh no, political campaigning.
Campaigning, okay.
Yes, I was amazed at the fact that you see these people on television and it's politics. It's this thing that seems so far off. I'm from a place this little place in the country. Then when I found out that you could show up someplace, you could meet that person, and then you could hear them speaking. All you have to do is go door to door. You have to collect some signatures for them. You have to show up to places. That's it. So I was so excited that you could actually be part of this system.
Right.
So my natural wiring.
Contribute. You can contribute.
I would wish it was that was part of it, and I wish it was just that pure. I was also very interested in having such a proximity to power, that you were able to have a proximity to power. And so, these are really weird things for a 14-year-old to think about. So openly admit that. So it was both. So I thought having proximity to power, then that drive for being able to put good people in office. I thought my efforts mattered. I really did.
Yeah.
The good thing about starting so young
did they?
Oh,
did your efforts matter? No? Why not?
No, because I didn't understand the system yet. I was
yeah, but you collected signatures, you did campaigning. You maybe it was not did not reform society, but you contributed to something that, that shaped society. There was some things that were ongoing, some whatever processes. I mean, you were part of it, no?
I never thought about it like that. I thought about it like that was a first step to understand a system more. And that if I'm going to learn more at a higher level in a system, I have to start somewhere. And that somewhere is putting in my time. If my dad was rich, if my dad was rich, he could have written a check and then I could have gone to a high level very quickly. But that was not the case. So I had to work. But then, the
case of many people, no.
So then what I didn't understand, so you would ask the question, and this is what I'm getting to, is that individual, like our individual agency versus a structure.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at these people and I've spent time with the candidates. I've spent time with them. You get to know their family, you get to know their friends, you get to know them. And then they go into office and all of a sudden they're part of the party. And unless you see that up close, you don't quite understand the way it works. If you don't vote with the party can mess with you in different ways. They can't exactly put you out of office, but they can cut your resources. They can cut your money. So where you would have time to campaign before, now you have to start recruiting people. You mean
if you don't vote with the party in parliament?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I mean, I only worked at a state level, so I can't even imagine at the national level what the what the pressure is. But your life will become much more difficult. Your colleagues are not going around you.
Okay.
You're kind of an outcast. It's a big deal to step away from the party. That's when I started to really get, when I walked into an office and I saw the staff sitting on the floor folding envelopes, and I said, why are you doing that? Doesn't the, House campaign committee do that for you? They said, not after this vote. I said, so, I mean, I've seen it in action, and that's what they do. And so there are direct repercussions. So this idea about just, get in there and do the right thing, not if you want to survive. So here's where the individual choices come, not if you want to survive.
So that's what you mean. That's where you're corrupted by the structure, right?
You can be, or you can take a different route. But if you take a different route, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will survive.
Yeah.
And that's always the tension. So how many people, even, we think about even in peacebuilding, think about the people who are literally on the front lines. I'm thinking about the civil rights movement in the United States, where there were dogs and clubs. Someone's going to get bit. Someone's going to get beaten. Somebody has to be on the front lines. And it's the same in every other place. When you're standing up for something, somebody's going to be on the front lines. So we face this when we're stepping up against systems. And the tension is people who have a family to feed, people who have professional self-interests, or people who think that if they can just get past this, then they'll be secure so that they can make changes. So there's all kinds of things going on. And yet you're functioning in these extremely dysfunctional systems. So these are levels of tension.
So in some situations, some levels, you can't be really authentic with your values, with your own, beliefs and visions, and
it depends on who you are. Not everybody has the stomach for everything. And
who you are in terms of position, or who you are in terms of personality? You,
person. Not everybody can do it.
If you dare to do it, and in that sense.
I just had a podcast episode, and it was a man called Richard Sharp. He's worked in philanthropy, nonprofit. So they were doing disaster relief for people and going into these situations that were impossible to get in and doing it. They were using former military. So it was very, very low level cost. But he was up against these systems of you need to do things this other way less effective way, or else you're not going to get funding. So that person, a lot of people in this space would acquiesce and find different strategies for the donors. And what this guy said was, no, I'm not going to do that. And so he changed the business model because he's not going to do that. Me, I was in a position where all I had to do was in philanthropy. All I had to do was take the money.
Mhm.
It made me physically sick. I had a blinding headache every day. I had health
Mm.
problems. I was losing my hair.
Wow.
I can't do that. People are, and I'm not saying anyone's, but like we all just have different paths that we are walking. So we're supposed to all be in different places and do different functions. So
Mhm.
there's, when I'm saying these examples, just because they're personal examples, everybody has their own purpose in this life.
Mhm.
But it's complicated. As I say, we could
Yeah.
spend 6 months talking about this question. It's complicated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes we have to go with the system, to be part of the system. And sometimes maybe we have to shake the system, but that's much more complicated.
And not
We
everybody
need
is
to-
for every role. We all do
Absolutely.
different things and we can contribute.
Absolutely. Yeah, coming back to peace building.
Mhm.
We discussed a little bit about violence, peace. So the title of this episode is Violence or Peace, a Thin Line. What's your experience based on your practical experience or your research? Maybe where does violence come from, or what's what triggers violence? What is the tipping point? It is a thin line. In many countries it's a thin line between revolution, violence, or peace. Some countries transition, some go back and forth. Usually I read some study about the sustainability of peace agreements, and I think it's about 75% or even more that actually fall back into violence and conflict and war after the signature of a peace agreement. So what is your reflection on that? What's the thin line? When does it tip on that side or on the other?
May I ask you a question about the research that you read?
I did a master's in peace and conflict studies long time ago. Must be 10 years ago, and I don't remember the reference.
I was just going to ask you, there's that number of 75% of them fall, but I was wondering why. Were there certain features of it? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a little idea on that. So, and I think it's they fall back after, I think the time was 5 years. After at least 5 years, they fall back. Well, the why, this is a very wide question. What I would say is probably one good answer is based on Lederach's research. Jean-Paul Lederach, with his peace building gaps. The what are they? The interdependence gap, the justice gap, and the other one was what? Process structure gap. So different gaps in terms of how we approach peace and how we do peace building work. So probably could actually draw some parallels to the initial discussion on the role of donors as well. Like one that is, I think, the fact that the peace is signed and you have the nice pictures with the elite and you have the picture on the news and so on, but on the bottom the people, they don't benefit. There is no peace dividend.
Right.
So you made some agreements, but the masses don't really benefit. So there is a lack of interdependence between the different levels of society. So this might be one explanation.
Well then, thank you. That's interesting and also is consistent with the way I was going to answer your question. You asked about, according to my research, according to my observations, what drives violent conflict?
Yeah.
Resources, money, natural resources. There's some profit. There's something to be gained. That's what drives it. So from that motivation, what the rest of that looks like can be sold in a lot of different ways to engage parties, to activate one group against another, but it's always resources. Someone's trying to get or someone's trying to defend. I can think of very few examples, and I'm thinking of the caveat that I would say, okay, let's divide it into two. There's the actual initiation of violent conflict, 100% resources. On the other hand, there is conflict that is brought about by the need of a group to defend their survival. That's reactive violence, and I would not categorize those the same way.
So protection, and so the resources part, that makes me think about class struggle. Is that the right reference for it, or not at all? Is it just simply having access and survival, or is it about, aspirations, getting higher, trying to get whatever power and new resources?
First of all, let me clarify those 2 points and then say the one area that I'm talking about. When a dominant group has infringed upon another group to the point where, say, for example, Palestinians take up arms, they're trying to survive at this point. There are other groups like that. I have a friend who embedded with Kurds, with the PKK. Some are considering this a terrorist organization, and he's talking with them, and they put people through school for a year before you're allowed to pick up an arm. It's not
soldier school.
What's that?
Soldier school. Oh, yeah.
No, just not even
education.
Even that. Education. You need to understand what you're doing there. So
Okay.
they're weeding out people who just want to be involved in violence. That's not what it's about. And the way that he phrased it in his research, how they put it when he was embedded, is they said, we're not fighting to kill, we're fighting to survive. So that's the differentiation that I would make. So groups of people who are fighting to survive, they are not part of this discussion. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about groups who initiate violence, and they do so for the purpose of resources. So the way you asked about class struggle, so it takes some forms, how it works. I'll just break it down. The first concept is called relative deprivation. Okay, so it's a group who feels like they don't have what they should have. Perhaps at one point they had more. They had more power, they had more money, they had more jobs. And now they're looking at another group, and they feel bitter towards that other group because they feel that other group has taken what is rightfully theirs. So it begins like that. Those are the fractures. Like, so the fissures are the attitudes, the fractures are the actual lines. And then what powerful people will do, they will exploit those fractures so that we have then an in-group and an out-group. So now if you can identify your enemy, there are a lot of helpful ways that the interested party trying to gain resources, when they're trying to activate these other groups, there are a lot of interesting ways that they'll just reinforce what's going on. So then the group that feels like they've been wronged, they have a clear enemy. And they have a clear direction now of, if we do this action against this enemy group, this out group, we will regain what we once had. It sounds very basic. Academic authors from many disciplines will put that different ways, but that's the basic recipe.
So how do you see the risk for violent developments in how do you call it, Western countries? We also have groups, but why does it not trigger into, well, sometimes it does, but why does it not more broadly trigger into violence? It's because the groups are closer to each other. If I take Switzerland as example, you take simply, the income gap between, the average income, the highest and the lowest, and the gap is relatively small compared to some other countries. Would that be a protector, or how do you see, is the West protected about this type of violent dynamics potentially, or are we also facing a risk, depending, because the gap is opening more and more apparently, and now with all the crises we're living now the last few years, and maybe the coming ones as well, how do you see the risk for the Western countries?
I can speak about the United States, because I believe when we say Western countries, we're of course also talking about Europe, and there are cultural variations and historic variations. So how in the United States, for example, when we would say like the ultra wealthy, that's relatively new, where in some European families, those have been for hundreds of years.
True. Yeah.
So in the United States, the idea that your circumstances can change, that too is actually a huge driver. It's something in terms of conflict. It gives, if you're trying to activate groups against each other, it gives you even more room to play with from a strategic standpoint. So the way that it would work, the way that I see it working here, if any group came out right now and said outwardly the color of one's skin and tried to divide like that, it wouldn't work. To some degree it would work, but it really wouldn't work. What I see happening right now is, since the 1960s, it's actually been since women being able to have birth control and reproductive rights over their body. So now we see more women graduating from college. We see women who are in higher, I mean, the numbers are still, of course, abysmal. They're not anything equal, but women are being educated. Women are financially independent. Women are gaining status and gaining economic independence. That's where I see the fight.
You mean that's in terms of position of women? Is it a gender fight, or is it because one group, I don't know if you can call it a group actually, but is gaining more status, or what triggers it? Is it an in-group, out-group, or
Oh, it's definitely in-group, out-group. Yeah. So there's the recipe. First, there has to be the victimization. A group has to feel a certain way about themselves. They've been victimized by what's going on. Then there's a threat to culture. You see, like, as long as this dynamic goes on, this isn't your fault. You know, the group, this isn't your fault. This is because somebody's done it to you. And then it's a threat to your way of life. And then if we keep letting this happen, all of our natural value, like all of our regular values, in this case, in the United States, how it's being used in an extremist way, all of the God-given values, all of God's law, this is all going to hell. So this is why we have to do something about it. That's the feel. So
it's status, it's gender, it's religion, it's...
I'll say the way it's power, and the vehicles of that power are through politics, through religion. But the base element that's being drawn upon is the gender element.
It's the same discussion currently in Iran, you know, where apparently that's what the researchers say, or the journalists as well, that there are many women actually studying, like 60% more than men, and now gaining status and having different situation in life and evolving. And would you draw a parallel to what you just said with the situation in Iran?
If you take the idea of male domination, right? So there's something called social dominance orientation. So when I say men, I'm not talking about all men. I'm not talking about all women. There's social dominance orientation. This can be held by men or women. But it's the idea that one group, like, somebody has to win and somebody has to lose.
It's a zero-sum game.
Oh, completely. Yep. And then what's happening is, in dominant culture, like we call it dominant discourse. So it's just what is said, what is understood, right? So that cultural system that people are living under, it makes certain things normal. And if you question those things, that's when you start to have problems. Because we were talking earlier about systems. So let's rein it back in. So for example, Iran, it's that same type of thing. A woman doesn't wear a headscarf. So what do? You take her in police custody and beat her to death.
Terrible.
It's not subtle. This control, it's not subtle. It's not for anybody's good, except for a group that's trying to control another group. These are very violent things.
And those who benefit, you know, by being in that group and in the system. And
absolutely. As I say, resources, because you're holding on to power. If you're holding on to power, you're holding on to the economic power. You're holding on to the political power. And that's what's happening on this end of the ocean too.
But actually, somehow you shaked my worldview to some point. You said it's zero-sum game. So is it? Yeah, that's a big point where I'm often struggling. You know, I don't know if it comes with age or, but I actually would say it's not a zero-sum game. I think it is a win-win. You know, life is a win-win, but the problem we have if it's not a win-win, if it's not a 1 + 1 = at least 3, if it's not such a game, but a zero-sum game, then maybe because few actors see it like that, that's always what I'm saying, when I had a huge discussion with one of my professors when I studied my Masters of Peace studies.
Mhm.
And my question was, we were talking in international relations, we were talking about how they called realists and idealists.
Yes.
Those who say realists, okay, we have to get more arms in order to be protected in case of. And the idealists who say, no, we have to, abandon the arms and, give up arms and more cooperation and so on. And so my question to my professor about my own standpoint was, so what if I believe that if you're all idealists in a room, then the world is going well and perfectly and so on. But what if you have just one realist in a room and all the others have to react because there's a realist, and then you need to react because the guy is going armed? You think you have to go to be better armed as well because the other guy is in the room, or in the room is meant like, symbolizing the world.
Mhm.
So what if you believe that? Are you still an idealist, or do you become a realist because you think you have to become armed because the other one is armed? Well, it's a very philosophical question, and but yeah, it's is it a zero-sum game or not?
Now, real life tells me there's no ideal. That you have situations, you have circumstances, and the realistic part is to understand what you are working with, not what you hope that other person is, but what they actually are.
That's the point that makes us become a realist, but we want to be idealist.
And realist, in your example, like realist means that you have a gun. There are different ways.
Because the other guy has a gun, and then I think, I need one as well. Otherwise, who knows?
There are different ways to do it. Again, like the research that I do, it's looking at understanding how that other person thinks. So if somebody has a gun, about the British Empire in India, they had the guns. They didn't have to negotiate. There were different tactics that were taken, economic tactics, different tactics that were taken.
Peaceful
it doesn't necessarily. Yeah, and a lot of people got hurt. It wasn't peaceful on the part of the people who had to go to the hospital or who didn't survive it. So again, we all have our different roles to play. So a huge bias that I discovered in graduate school, like 3 major things. The first thing is that deep down, everybody means well. Couldn't be further from the truth. Deep down, everybody does not mean well. Deep down, people are people and they're doing what they're doing. The second thing was money is ignored and emotions are ignored. And from what I see, it's because it's difficult to put those into paper, into literature. It's difficult to study those. And it's difficult to put
emotions, you mean?
Emotions and financial interests. Money and emotions were something that we just didn't talk about. But without those, there was no room for it. There was no literature for it. So I actually incorporate those. And I'm saying, like, you have to understand what a person is motivated by. You have to understand what another group is motivated by. And it's not what you think it is. You can't think about it from, there was a book, How We Think They Think. So you can't do it like that. You have to understand how the other group actually thinks.
That's typically the work of mediation, the changing of perspectives. Try to understand the other, and even try to understand yourself better. Because also we don't necessarily know what drives ourselves.
Oh God, very much. And so, getting back to that issue of what drives conflict, something that is hugely it doesn't necessarily mean that it would turn into violence. But one of the things that is really helpful if you're moving in the direction of violence is groups who don't feel the need to interact with each other, who don't see the point in understanding the other one. When you come to that space, that it's a dangerous space because you can be very easily controlled.
Indeed. Right. Maybe to close to slowly come to an end of discussion. We discussed a lot about violence, conflict, and so on. if we turn it around, so just a few words, a few reflections. What is peace for you? How would you define peace? You gave a definition of conflict, one that I completely share in the beginning. How would you define peace?
Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of conflict. Peace is the ability of people, even though it's going to be very uncomfortable, to engage with one another as individuals, as groups, as people who don't see things the same way.
Great.
It's their ability to engage with each other and come out the other side still human, even though they don't agree.
Thank you very much. So I see we have the same references, some same philosophy of life. I think these are very, very nice closing words. A very nice definition of peace. We should strive for peace, whatever comes on the road to it. I think that's maybe another an additional reflection that I would add. And yeah, I thank you very much for this discussion. I don't know if you want to add something, any last word, any last thing maybe we didn't mention, any point we forgot, any word to the community.
The one thing that I would absolutely leave people with, you yourself always have the ability to implement change. And what you do in your own life does have reverberating effects. So your character matters. All the time, your character matters. No matter what's going on around you, you are in control of your character.
Be the change you want to see in the world.
You have to. It won't work otherwise.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca. It was very nice, very great discussion. I will put a couple of links to your website and podcast and so on in the description. And again, thank you very much for this discussion. And
thank you.
Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Have a good time. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.